Hello there. Greetings. My name is Ron Egan. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to lecture to you in your course on Honglou Meng. I'll be lecturing 2 times. Today, mostly on the question of Honglou Meng in the context of world literature and translation. And then the next time I'll lecture more about internal traits of Honglou Meng itself. 我首先要感谢罗仕龙教授给我这个机会跟你们交流，很荣幸也很高兴有今天这样的机会。I had originally been invited to come give you lectures in person. That happened last December when I visited your campus in Hsinchu for a conference I participated in on Song Dynasty literature. And I met Professor Luo at that time, and he invited me to come back in April or May and give lectures. And since then, of course, everything has happened with coronavirus, and for me to travel to Taiwan is no longer possible. And even for you to all gather in a lecture hall, I guess, is no longer possible, at least for the moment. So that's why I'm doing these lectures this way by video, and I would have preferred to be with you in person, but we'll make the best of the situation as we have to deal with it now. So I teach Chinese literature at Stanford University in California. 我并不是《红楼梦》专家. I'm not a specialist in Honglou Meng. I'm a specialist in Tang Song literature, especially poetry and aesthetics. But I have taught Honglou Meng in English translation several times to large classes of students. And I'm a big fan of Honglou Meng. I'm a tremendous avid reader of the novel. And even though I'm not a scholarly specialist in Hongxue or anything like that, I am an enthusiastic reader and thinker about the novel. And so I'm delighted to have this chance to share some thoughts with you about the novel. These are the topics that we're going to talk about today. Introduction, which is what we're doing now, and then one by one, these topics. Knowledge of Honglou Meng outside of Chinese-speaking communities, why so little? 华人社会以外的读者对《红楼梦》的认识为什么那么陌生? What works of Chinese literature are known in foreign countries? 中国文学中的哪一些作品在外国最有名望? Translation. The translation of Honglou Meng by David Hawkes and John Manfred, which is called The Story of the Stone in English translation. 红楼梦的音译，霍克斯与门福的翻译的石头记。David Hawkes' translation notebooks, 霍克斯的翻译笔记, which we will look at. And then stepping back and considering 2 other larger questions. What else needs to be done to make Honglou Meng part of world literature? 红楼梦成为世界文学 公认的经典还需要哪一些条件 and what would be accomplished or gained if that were done. 红楼梦若公视为世界文学经典之一，有什么效果 So these are the topics I want to talk about, and I'll talk, a few minutes about each one of these in today's lecture. Oh, here I just wanted to show you, you've probably already seen some of these beautiful illustrations. These are 19th century illustrations of the novel. Here's a scene in which Yuan Chun, comes home for the first time, and 进入大观园, and then here she's supervising a poetry writing by the young people. She's up at the head of the table here, and the young people are with their brushes and paper to write poetry are aligned on either side here. These paintings, I'll show you a few of these as we go through the lecture. These are done by someone named Sun Wen, and the original album of his illustrated edition of Honglou Meng is kept today in Lu Shun Guan in China, and they're just beautiful illustrations. So the first real topic I want to talk about is to ask the question and try to explain a little bit about why Honglou Meng is so little known outside of Chinese-speaking communities. So there's this great irony. Honglou Meng is so incredibly well known in Chinese communities and so little known outside. How can we understand that, and maybe understanding it, we can begin to think of a way of fixing this situation. It's no exaggeration to say here for example, in the USA, even among university professors of literature, if you go into the English department or even the comparative literature department, and you ask not just students, but even faculty, even professors there, about Honglou Meng, they won't know what you're talking about. Very few people outside of those of us in the field of Chinese studies have ever heard of this novel. And even professors of English who are very familiar with great novels in French and in Spanish and in German and in Russian, do they know anything about the Chinese novel Honglou Meng? I'm afraid not. Okay, it's really quite shocking, the level of lack of knowledge of this great work. And surely one reason for that, I think that I'll talk about a few reasons, but one reason for this is that unlike the great works of French and German and Russian literature, in the case of Honglou Meng, there has not been a good readable English translation until very recently. And that's the translation of David Hawkes and John Manfred that I'll be talking about. So, in the case of, let's think about Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelists. There have been very good English translations of their works for well over 100 years. And the same is true of translations of Don Quixote or 18th and 19th century French and German novels. In the case of Honglou Meng, it's only about 35 years ago that the first good English translation became available. There were some efforts before that, and I'll show you in a minute, but they were not successful efforts to translate the novel into English. I've listed here, this is not a complete list, but these are probably the most important four attempts to translate the novel, the fourth being the one I'm going to concentrate on talking about today, the one by David Hawkes and John Manfred, The Story of the Stone. But as you can see, and that was only finished in 1986. And before that, starting in 1929, there's a translation by Wang Jizhen, and then another one by Florence and Isabel McHugh in 1958. Those two, the Wang Jizhen and the Florence and Isabel McHugh, were abridged translations, seriously abridged. I mean, they probably didn't translate more than 30 or 35 chapters of the 120 chapter novel. The first full translation was the Gladys Yang and Yang Xianyi Yang, the third translation listed here, Dream of Red Mansions. That was the first complete one. It exists in three volumes of English translation. So it has the advantage of being the first complete effort to translate Honglou Meng into English, but it suffers from being not very readable. It's rather studied and serious and a little academic English rather than very lively and colloquial English. So the David Hawkes and John Manfred translation I'll be talking about later. And that is by far the most successful of the translations and the most recent, and the one that we have to pin our hopes on if Honglou Meng is ever going to become really known outside of Chinese communities. It's going to be through the Hawkes and Manfred translation, because now finally in that work we have a masterpiece of translation, one that you can put in the hands of interested readers, students, and be confident that it will convey a sense, a good sense of the original. I listed, there's translations into other language. Some of these are abridged, but interestingly enough, aside from English translations, Honglou Meng has most often been translated into Japanese and Korean. There are several Japanese translations. I just put one there. And there are several Korean translations. So it's not fair to say that Honglou Meng is completely unknown outside of Chinese language communities. It is known in Asia. It is known in Japan, and it is known in Korea. But then when you go outside of Asia, knowledge of Honglou Meng declines. So translation into English is probably the main reason why Honglou Meng is unknown in the English-speaking world and in the world of Europe. But it's not the only reason. It's not the only challenge that we face trying to permit Honglou from becoming known and becoming a respectable title in the canon of world literature. There are other challenges too. One has to do with the great length of the novel. You know, it's 120 chapters, and it's a tremendously complex, long story. The number of characters, you know, hundreds of people appear in the pages of this novel. The great complexity of plot, where you have several levels of action going on at the same time, both the Daguanyuan, the young people, and then you have the world of the adults in Jia family, and then you have the world of Qing society outside of Jia clan, including even at the apex, the world of the Chinese emperor and the court, which of course figures in the novel too. And then another challenge to introduce this novel to non-Chinese speakers is that it's so deeply rooted in imperial Chinese culture, especially the culture of the Qing dynasty. For example, it's very hard for a non-Chinese reader to grasp the dynamics and the complexities of the family system that is so important, and all of the complex relations, not only between Bao Yu and his father, but between his mother and his father, between his mother and other family members, between Xue Baotai and her family and the Jia clan, and between Lin Daiyu and her situation and the Jia clan. For a non-Chinese reader to enter into this world of very complicated domestic life in an extended Chinese family is kind of a shock. And it takes some explaining and some getting used to. On top of that, there's other aspects of the novel that are a challenge for a non-Chinese reader, someone who's largely ignorant of traditional Chinese society. The imperial government, the not only the emperor and his and the palace, but even the bureaucratic system, because of course Jia Zheng and other male family members are part of that government bureaucracy and officialdom with hereditary titles, and then there's this whole the whole issue of the civil service examinations. Bao Yu has his father. Nothing is more important to Jia Zheng than having Bao Yu be well prepared to take and pass the Keju system, and that's a very foreign to a non-Chinese reader. That's a very foreign educational system and a very foreign system. Why does Bao Yu have to learn all these classics? Why is it so important that he memorize? Why is it so important that he learn to write Baguwan? These are all questions that are issues that are very puzzling at first to the reader who's not familiar with Chinese culture. Then there's the whole issue of all the festivals, the New Year's celebration, and then again about domestic life is the issue of who are all these servants and why are they so numerous and why are they so important in the novel. This is not a kind of society that readers who are not familiar with traditional China are going to understand easily. So it takes a lot of adjustment. It takes a lot of patience for readers to immerse themselves. I've taught this novel to American university students, and on the first day of class, I tell them, you're going to, if you stay in this class, you're going to enter a world that you have no idea even exists. You're going to move in to a way of life and a way of structuring society and a way of existing in a family that you have never experienced before. And you had no idea it even existed anywhere. But in this novel, once you enter the pages of this novel, you're going to be immersed in this. It's like going into, it's going into another world. It's going into another world. And for modern readers, especially modern readers who exist outside of Chinese culture and outside of Chinese history and institutions, this is a big step, and it's not an easy step to take. So I want to talk, before I go on talking about Honglou Meng, I want to talk a little bit about what works of Chinese literature are known in foreign countries. It's not the case. See, Honglou Meng is especially unknown. There are other Chinese writings that are better known outside of China than Honglou Meng is. And Honglou Meng has these special challenges that I've just been talking about that make it particularly difficult for non-Chinese readers to grasp and to get interested in. If someone asks me, okay, what are the works of traditional Chinese literature that are best known, I think the first one that comes to mind is Tang poetry. The works of Li Bai and Wang Wei and people like Han Shan, Wang Wei, Han Shan, they're quite accessible to English readers, and they exist in many different Tang poetry. Of course, it's selected. It's not only tiny bits, but it's very easy for English readers to read good translations of Li Bai and Bo Juyi and Han Shan, and to immediately understand them and identify with them, and to see the point and the emotions that are being expressed, and to empathize and to appreciate them. So Tang poetry, it's widely translated into English, and it's successful, and it has successfully reached out to people who otherwise know nothing about Chinese. It's very transmissible. It adapts very well. The next best thing, next best known kind of writing is early Chinese philosophy. Confucius and Mencius, and of course Lao Tzu. Lao Tzu exists in something like 100 different English translations. People are a certain kind of English readers and thinkers and students, and are very receptive to Lao Tzu. Maybe 论语 is more difficult because it requires more explaining, but something like Mengzi is very easy. If it's translated well, and has been translated several times into English, it's very accessible, and you can read Mengzi, and you enter the world of ancient Chinese thought, and it's quite possible to understand the arguments that are being made. Lao Tzu is because it's so short, and because it's so mystical, It has great appeal in English translation. Zhuangzi less so, but Zhuangzi is beginning to be known. There are English translations, a few different ones of Zhuangzi. So we have Tang poetry, we have Zhuzi, we have the early philosophical writings. Then I suppose now moving down into lesser and lesser known, the Tang poetry is at the top, and maybe Meng Laozi are next best known, and then maybe third best known are some of the stories of like San Yan and Ming and Qing stories, Liao Zhai Zhi Yi, which has been translated 2 or 3 times, complete translations into English. Yes, people, English readers can read them and appreciate them and enjoy them. Then we get to the novels, and all of a sudden we're in a much worse situation. The great Chinese novels, Shuihu, Sanguo Yanyi, Jinping Mei, are pretty much like Honglou Meng. They're almost completely unknown in English. Sanguo, they exist in English translations, especially Sanguo Yanyi, a complete translation exists of it. And Jinping Mei, the first complete English translation was only finished a few years ago by David Roy, a professor of Chinese literature at University of Chicago. So it's too early. It's 4 volumes long, only completed a few years ago. So it's too early to say what how successful that the English version of Jinping Mei will be. So when I say that these great novels, Shuihu, Sanguo Yanyi, Jinping Mei, are to this day are pretty much unknown. There's one exception to this generalization, and that is a peculiar abridged translation of COG. COG in Arthur Waley's translation, which is not even called COG. It's not even called Journey to the West. I mean, the literal translation of COG should be Journey to the West, right? It's called Monkey. And this is a translation that was done a long time ago. It was done in the 1940s. And it was published, the first publication was 1942. This, with an introduction by Hu Shi, of all people, who's widely enthusiastic not only about COG, but about Arthur Waley's translation. This is a special case. This is one instance of a English translation of a Chinese novel that has been very successful and is very well known. It's been taught, for example, in American colleges and universities as Monkey, not as COG, but as an English translation called Monkey. It's been taught for decades, and it's been taught very successfully. American students love Waley's Monkey. It's translated in a very lively way. It's shortened. It's very abridged, but it's abridged in a special way. Those earlier translations of Honglou Meng that I mentioned, the one by Wang Jizhen and Florence and Isabel McHugh, they were abridgments that just cut up each chapter and offered or presented maybe a third or a quarter of each chapter and tried to get through as much of the novel in that way as they could. Arthur Waley's strategy when he translated COG as Monkey was to translate entire episodes, every word of entire episodes, but then he left a lot of episodes out, okay? So it only has, his translation only has about 30 chapters, and it is less than half of the novel he has translated. But the chapters that he has chosen to translate, he translated every word. And so the texture of the original, the humor of the original, the style of the original comes through. I should note in passing that this is the cover of the original, and of course he chose. He named his translation after Xingzhe, after the monkey, because as we all know, monkey is the most memorable, most lively character in COG. And so instead of calling it Journey to the West, which means nothing to an English reader, it was given the title The Adventures of Monkey. I should point out that Arthur Waley himself he was not a professor. He's a poet, a writer, a translator. He translated many works from Chinese and Japanese. He taught himself. He's British. He lived in England in the middle of the 20th century, from the early through the middle of the 20th century. Not an academic. He was a curator at for many years at the British Museum, and that's apparently how he got interested in Chinese and Japanese culture, and he taught himself these languages. Never went to China, never went to Asia, but he immersed himself in Chinese. He translated widely from Chinese. He translated the poetry of Bo Ju-yi. He translated the Tao Te Ching. He translated Lun Yu, and he translated Dunhuang, Bianwen, but his most successful and his most famous translation is the translation of Monkey. Let me, just to give you a little sense of the style of his translation, let me read you just a couple paragraphs from this is 十四会 六贼无踪 incident where Sanzang and Xingzhe run into these robbers, and the robbers are threatening them. Monkey took his needle from behind his ear, recited a spell which changed it into a huge cudgel, and cried, "Hold your ground and let old Monkey try his hand upon you." The robbers fled in confusion, but in an instant he was among them, striking left and right. He killed them all, stripped off their clothing, and seized their baggage. Then he came back to Tripitaka. Sanzang, in this translation, Waley calls him Tripitaka. Sanzang, the three baskets of scriptures. Laughing, said, "Master, we can start now. I have killed them all." "I am very sorry to hear that," said Tripitaka. "One has no right to kill robbers, however violent and wicked they may be. The most one may do is bring them before a magistrate. It would have been quite enough in this case if you had driven them away. Why kill them? You have behaved with a cruelty that ill becomes one of your sacred calling," because, of course, the monkey is announced that he intends to become, he's out to find Buddhist salvation. "If I had not killed them," said Monkey, "they would have killed you." "A priest," said Tripitaka, "should be ready to die rather than commit acts of violence." "I don't mind telling you," said Monkey, "that 500 years ago, when I was a king, I killed a pretty fair number of people, and if I held your view, I certainly would never have become great sage equal to heaven." "It was because of your unfortunate performances in heaven," said Tripitaka, "that you must do penance for 500 years. If now you have repented and become a priest, you go on behaving as you did in your old days, you can't come with me to India. You've made a very bad start." The one thing Monkey had never been able to hear was to be scolded. And when Tripitaka began to lecture him like this, he flared up at once and cried, "All right, I'll give up being a priest. I won't go with you to India. You needn't go on at me anymore. I'm leaving." And with that, Monkey stormed off. So I hope you can, from this little passage, you get a sense. And I also want to read you what Hu Shi says in his introduction that he wrote to Whaley's translation in 1942. Mr. Whaley has on the whole exercised excellent critical judgment in his selection of the episodes. I agree with most of his omissions and heartily approve of his method of omitting many episodes but translating those that are retained in full. His rendering of dialogue is truly masterful, both in preserving its humor and retaining its rich proverbial form. Only a careful comparison with the original text can fully appreciate the translator's painstaking effort in these directions. Freed of all kinds of allegorical interpretations by Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian commentators, Monkey, that is C-O-G, is simply a book of good humor, profound nonsense, good-natured satire, and delightful entertainment. It has delighted millions of Chinese children and adults for 300 years, and thanks to Mr. Whaley, it will now delight thousands upon thousands of children and adults in the English-speaking world for many years to come. That's the way Hu Shi ends his introduction. And Hu Shi was right. Whaley's translation has thrilled and delighted many for centuries. What do we learn from this example of Arthur Whaley's translation of C-O-G? One lesson we can take away, I think, is that a bridge translation has great potential if done without losing the essential traits of the original. And another lesson that we can take away from the success of Arthur Whaley's C-O-G translation is the advantages of a literary translation over an academic one. I should tell you that in the last, I guess it was completed about 15 or 20 years ago, there is a different and complete English translation of C-O-G. And that one is called Journey to the West. And it was done by a professor of Chinese literature and religion also at University of Chicago, named Anthony Yu. And that I would call an academic translation. The translator, as I say, is a scholar of Chinese religion. That's why he's interested in C-O-G. And he translates it very faithfully, very accurately. But alas, his translation does not have the spirit, does not have the liveliness, does not take the liberties, and does not render it into the colloquial vernacular style that Whaley's translation does. And so to this day, even though Whaley's is much older and is incomplete, if you're going to put an English version of C-O-G into the hands of a general reader, you're not going to select Anthony Yu's translation. You're going to select Arthur Whaley's translation. And Whaley's translation will continue because of its style, because of its the accuracy with which it captures the fun and the liveliness of the original. It will continue to be the dominant English translation of this great Chinese work. Okay, I want to move on now to our next topic, which is the David Hawkes, John Manfred translation. This is one more scene from the Sun Wen illustrated volume. You can see this is Jia Zheng leading the gentleman friends on the first tour of the garden, and there of Daguanyuan, and there you can see Jia Zheng, and this is Bao Yu, and Jia Zheng is explaining something as they're going from building to building within the garden. Okay, let's go on to the translation. So as you can see, this is a project that took from 1973 to 1986. So 13, 14 years. It exists in 5 volumes. They're Penguin, I'm holding one of them up for you. They're Penguin paperbacks, they're Penguin classics. Altogether, 5 of these volumes amount to 2,500 pages, roughly. David Hawkes, who's the senior of the 2 translators, it was his idea, it's his project. He did the first 3 volumes, which is the first 80 chapters of Honglou, and then he turned the project over to John Manfred, who is also a scholar, a sinologist in his own right, and happens also to be David Hawkes's son-in-law. So, in nice fashion of father-in-law and son-in-law, Manfred picked up the project where Hawkes left it off, and he finished the last 40 chapters from 81 to 120, and that is the last 2 of the 5 volumes. So it's a project the 2 men devoted themselves to full-time while they were doing it. First Hawkes during the 1970s, and then Manfred during the 1980s. You might wonder why they called it The Story of the Stone as their title rather than Dream of the Red Chamber. You may know that Shitou Ji is in fact one of the early titles of the novel. It's mentioned in the first chapter of the novel, where several alternate titles are mentioned. So it's not something that they made up at all. And insofar as Bao Yu is a stone sent, a stone from the heavens sent down to earth, and a stone on which, according to the first chapter, the entire story is written. The story of the stone is not inappropriate nomenclature for the novel. I think Hawkes also probably, and this comes up in various places where he talked about his translation, he had difficulty with Hong as a translation as redness, red mansion, or because red has very different connotations in English than it does in Chinese. And he didn't think that red mansions or dream of red chambers, etc., makes much sense in English. And I think that's a second reason why he preferred to choose the alternate Chinese title, Shitou Ji, and make that his major title. This is I'm just showing you the covers of a few of the volumes in the Penguin series. This is a later edition of Volume 1 with Chinese paintings gracing of ladies gracing the cover, volume 3, volume 4, etc. Altogether 5 volumes, as I said. Let me talk a little bit about David Hawkes, so you have some understanding of the translator that I'll be talking about. He was born in the 1920s. I think it's 23. He was born. He attended Oxford University. He's British. He attended Oxford in the 1940s and got interested in Chinese, and then went to Beijing at a time when very few foreigners were traveling or studying in Beijing, 1948 to 1951, which are, of course, difficult years in China, less difficult maybe in Beijing than in other places. He spent 3 years, and he studied at Beida, actually. He studied at Peking University. He sat in on classes by Yu Pingbo, the famous Honglou Meng scholar, and Luo Changpei, the linguist. So he got to know and become familiar with Honglou Meng, although he never dreamed in those days that he'd be one day translating the whole thing. He returned to Oxford and finished his PhD in 1958, and his PhD dissertation was on Chuzi. This very difficult, very, very marvelous and challenging collection of ancient Chinese poetry. He befriended and was a young admirer of Arthur Waley, who I was talking about earlier, the great translator of COG, and other works. And I think it's important to see the significance of that friendship, because when David Hawkes turned to popular literary translation, it's very clear that Arthur Waley was largely his model. Hawkes became chair in Chinese at Oxford in 1959, and he held that professorship until he resigned in 1971 to devote himself full-time to his Honglou Meng translation project. People in the field. I can remember this because I was a graduate student when this in the United States when this happened. But when he resigned, sort of very suddenly from this very prestigious post at Oxford, people in the field were kind of shocked. Isn't this a very reckless thing to do? And he resigned without having another job. He had no income suddenly. But this is how committed he was to the Honglou Meng translation. And his friends in England, rallied to help him and got him a position at a research institute that didn't require teaching, and so eventually he could devote himself full time to the translation. I mentioned that his PhD dissertation was Chuzi, and his first translation was based on that dissertation, and it's in print today. It's called Songs of the South. It's a complete translation of Chuzi from Li Sao, Jiu Ge, Jiu Zhang, etc. All the Chuzi pieces. And then later on, he produced a lovely little volume, which is intended. It's really not a work of scholarship. It's intended almost like a school book for English readers who are learning Chinese and are interested not just in modern Chinese, but in classical Chinese poetry. And this volume, called A Little Primer of Du Fu, selects just the 唐诗300首里面的杜甫诗 and one by one translates them line by line, explicates them in English with the Chinese, and is a learner's guide to how you can go about teaching yourself a little bit about Tang poetry and a little bit about Du Fu. It's a lovely lovely book. Here's a picture of Hawks in the center there with two of his friends in Beijing in 1947. William Epson became a famous literary scholar and critic, and the Epsons were in Beijing and got to know David Hawkes at that time. And here's a picture of David Hawkes in his later years. I think this must have been taken after he finished his translation. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the special features of his Story of the Stone translation. The ones that come to mind to say something about are the approach he takes, the style that he strives to capture, his treatment of poetry, and the various aids that the book presents to help the reader find his or her way through this difficult work. As for the style of the translation, it's very colloquial. It's very free. He takes a lot of liberties with, if you look at the words of the English side by side with the words of the Chinese of any paragraph or of any sentence, you will find that Hawkes takes a lot of leeway. He allows himself a lot of license as a translator. What he does not take liberties or license with is the meaning. He is very meticulous in trying to capture the meaning of every single sentence. And I want to emphasize that this is a translation of every sentence of the novel. Nothing is skipped, nothing is omitted. But within that commitment to capture the essence of meaning, he does not feel chained to the exact words of the Chinese, or much less to the syntax or the word order of the Chinese sentence. He's very free in rearranging, in paraphrasing, so as to try as best he can to capture the underlying meaning of everything that is said and of every description. So in a minute, I'm going to read you just a few sentences to give you a taste of the result. A special feature, and no one else, no other translator of Honglou has ever dared to do this, is that you all know that poetry is a very important component of the novel. And one thing that Hawkes does is that he makes all the poetry rhyme in English. Okay, this is a very difficult thing to do, extremely difficult thing to do. And he says somewhere in an interview after, when he's talking about his translation, he says that when he first had the idea of doing the translation, he promised himself that he would first experiment and see if he could turn the novel's poetry, no matter who it's written by, one of the characters in the novel or by the narrator, see if he could turn it into English rhyming verse, English rhyming poetry. And he felt that if he couldn't do that, he really didn't want to do the project. And I think the sense of of his, why he felt this was so important, was that he rightly perceived that poetry in the novel, it may not be great poetry, but it's very amusing. It's a lot of fun. It has a lot of wordplay. It has a lot of wit and ingenuity. And if you turn it into English, blank verse, free verse that does not rhyme, you lose a lot of the playfulness. You lose a lot of the fun that the poetry captures in the novel. So he rightly perceived, I think, how essential the poetry is. It's not something that anybody, especially a translator, should treat lightly or should minimize the importance of, much less skip over. He took it very seriously, as serious fun. And I'll show you an example. Genealogy and character index, I mentioned before that these are, the number of characters is so large, and the possibility for confusing them is so great that the English reader needs help. And so Hawkes, at the back of every volume, this is just one page, this is not the whole thing, there's more pages, gives a genealogy table in which anybody can look and find the English name, the pinyin name of the character. They're wondering, well, how is Yuan Chun related to Bao Yu or Tan Chun, or how is Jia She related to Jia Zheng, or and things like this are great aids to the reader. He also, at the back of every volume, has a alphabetized list of all the characters who appear in that volume. Now, of course, it's alphabetized by the English translation that he uses for the name, not the Chinese. The Hanzi would be meaningless. This is a index to the characters in the English translation, and so it has to be alphabetized according to the whichever way he has decided to represent the names. So these are very the genealogy chart, the list of characters. These are immensely helpful to the reader. And here I want to talk about another device, another sort of a very ingenious kind of tool that Hawkes uses. He recognized that one of the greatest challenge probably for the English reader is to keep track of all the characters, and to figure out who's who, and to remember the names, and to remember the statuses of the persons who are attached to that name. Okay. And when everything is reduced to pinyin, it becomes the pinyin, just the personal names. If they were all reduced to pinyin, they would be overwhelming. So Hawkes hit upon an ingenious way of signaling to the reader not just the name of the person, but the status of the person. And look what he has done. So in the pages of the novel, we have Bao Yu, we have Dai Yu, we have Jia Zheng. These are all just pinyin romanization. Si Feng, Jia Lian, Tan Chun, etc. But we have aroma for Si Ren, patience for Ping Er, faithful for Yuan Yang, nightingale for Zi Juan, skybright for Qing Wen, tea leaf for Ming Yan, moonbeam, Bao Tan. Okay, so what he's done is, and this is, I mean, of course, this is something that's not, this is a distinction that's not in the novel itself. This is a distinction the translator is making as an aid to the reader. But it's very ingenious, because a reader gets used to this very quickly. And when you see that it's, oh, now it's aroma speaking, or it's patience speaking, or it's faithful doing something, the reader knows immediately, oh, that's a servant in the family. Whereas when the reader sees, oh, it's Jia Zheng doing something, or Si Feng speaking, okay, the reader knows immediately, oh, that's a family member. That's a major character, a family member in the novel. And so Hawkes uses this distinction, this device of differentiating the family members by pinyin, romanization of name, and the servants by English translations of something that approximates, if we were to represent the meaning of, and the translations are actually very clever. Aroma for siren, patience for pinger, faithful for yuan yang. These are very clever. I'm sure he thought long and hard about that. And it doesn't stop there. The actresses, the Siju Yan Yan that the family hires, they're given French names. So it's like parfumé for Fang Guan. So as soon as we see a French name, we know, oh yeah, that's a member of the acting troupe. And the Buddhists and Taoists in the novel are given Latin names, like Miao Yu become Adamantina, and Kong Kong Daoren become Vanitas. And if they're not given Latin names, they're named according to Catholic usage, like Ma Dao Po, Mother Ma. So naming, Hawkes recognized as one of the chief stumbling blocks, one of the chief difficulties that the novel presents in translation. And he came upon these very clever devices as a way of dealing with that challenge that the names present. Just to give you a tiniest taste of how this sounds in English, I'll just read to you a few lines from the very first meeting in Di San Hui, the chapter 3, the very first time Bao Yu and Dai Yu meet. I'm sure you've read this. And I imagine you can recall what happens. And I just want to read you the way Hawkes turns this into his English translation. So first we get Dai Yu's perception of Bao Yu. There's a long description when Bao Yu comes into the room, and there's a long description of his elaborate clothes and garments and ornaments, and then we finally get to Dai Yu. Dai Yu looked at him with astonishment. How strange! How very strange! It was as though she had seen him somewhere before. He was so extraordinarily familiar. Bao Yu went straight past her and saluted his grandmother, who told him to come back after he had seen his mother, whereupon he turned around and walked straight out again. Quite soon he was back once more, this time dressed in a completely different outfit. And now we have another long paragraph about his new change of clothes. And then we go back inside Dai Yu's mind. She was even more struck than before by his fresh complexion, the cheeks that might have been brushed with powder and the lips touched with rouge, so bright was their natural color. In short, his outward appearance was very fine, but appearances can be misleading. A perceptive poet has supplied 2 sets of verses to be sung to the tune Moon on West River, which contain a more accurate appraisal of our hero than the foregoing descriptions. And I'm going to read Hawkes' translation of the first poem about you, and I have it written out so you can look at it as I read out loud. Ofttimes he sought what would make him sad. Sometimes an idiot seemed, and sometimes mad. Though outwardly a handsome sausage skin, he proved to have but sorry meat within. A harum-scarum, to all duty blind, a doltish mule, to study disinclined. His acts outlandish and his nature queer, yet not a whit cared he how folk might jeer. You see, I talked about the fact that Hawkes was so committed to rhyming the poetry. You see how entertaining it is when it rhymes. And if it didn't rhyme, the playfulness, the wit, the sarcasm of the poetry, of which this is an example, would be lost. And then just to finish this scene, finally, Bao Yu, notices Dai Yu standing there. It's the first time they've been in the same room together. And there's a description of his perception of her. And then listen to what he says when he begins to talk. Having completed his survey of her, Bao Yu gave a laugh. I have seen this cousin before. Nonsense, said Grandmother Jia. How could you possibly have done so? Well, perhaps not, said Bao Yu, but her face seems so familiar that I have the impression of meeting her again after a long separation. All the better, said Grandmother Jia. That means you should get on very well together. Okay. So I hope you can see, just from these few lines, how colloquial, how immediate, how vivid is the English that Hawkes, works at to represent and try to capture the freshness, the liveliness, the vitality of the Chinese language of Honglou Meng, and he does this very well in English. Oh, I remember one of the earliest great appreciators of what David Hawkes had done was Qian Zhongshu, the great literary scholar in Beijing. He wrote a review when Hawkes' first volume came out in 1973. Shortly thereafter, Qian Zhongshu wrote a review. And I'll just paraphrase. He says, I think this is toward the end of his review, which was very glowing, very positive. And toward the end of his review, he says something by way of comparison. He says, other translators have come upon a stone and left it a brick. Now he says other translators. He doesn't specify who he's thinking of, but most people who know anything about the history of translation of Honglou Meng would think immediately that he's talking about Yang Xianyi and Gladys Yang. They have come upon a stone, of course, 石头记, right, and left it a brick, meaning they left it in a very crude, in a very rough form. David Hawkes came upon a stone and turned it into jade. 石头记就变成宝玉, right? So this is very, very typical of Qian Zhongshu's wit, and it it shows his appreciation for what Hawkes had accomplished. Now, in the next section of what we're going to talk about, I want to show you quickly. It turns out that David Hawkes, during the years that he was doing this translation work, he kept notebooks of his project. And these were written not for you or me. They're written for himself, and they're all about the problems that he encounters as a translator as he's working chapter by chapter and page by page through the first 80 chapters of the novel that he was trying to get to the end of. And eventually, these notebooks came to light, and in May of the year 2000, people in Hong Kong, and particularly at Lingnan Daxue, who found out about the existence of these notebooks, persuaded Hawkes to give them permission to publish the notebooks. And so they exist. It's one big, huge, hefty volume, and not all university libraries have a copy of this. I don't know if yours does or not. Even mine at Stanford, my library at Stanford does not have its own copy. I had to get it through interlibrary loan. But it's very interesting if you want to see something about how this particular translator worked. I don't claim that this is revealing about all translators. It's revealed, but it's very revealing about David Hawkes. Now they're written, as I said, only for himself. They're not. He never expected them to be published, and so they're written in longhand, and his handwriting is hard to read, hard to decipher. Because he's just making notes for himself as he goes along. When he stops, when he pauses, when he encounters a problem, and he tries to think about how to solve the problem, that's when he starts scribbling in his notebook. They're all dated. And so this page is. I've just selected a few pages I want to share. I want to show you. This is Friday, 4th of February, 1972, and he's working on. 23 circled here means chapter 23. And then these are dates in the novel, of events in the novel. So this is, and what Hawkes is doing, he has all these characters coming and going, entering the scene and leaving the scene and referring to things that happen off camera, out of the scene. And Hawkes is trying to arrange all these references to something happening yesterday or something we're planning to do tomorrow, and try to make a coherent timeline out of them. So 315 means, the 15th day of the third month. 316 is the 16th day of the third month. And the novel doesn't do this, of course. Hawkes is trying to do this to make sense of all these events, so that before he actually gets to the point of translating chapter 23, has a coherent timeline in his mind, because he thinks it'll help him do the translation work. And you notice he has all these events with dates spanning nearly a month, from 315 to 4/6 or 4/8, and then at the top here he has an X. That means I'm wrong. and we turn to the next page, and he scribbled at the top of the page, preceding no good, meaning I worked it all out, but it's not right. It's not satisfactory. And so now he starts again, and again he crosses out, because he's finding inconsistencies, or he's finding contradictions in what happens. And so I'm looking at these pages, and I kept turning, and now finally on the third or fourth page, you find now he's expanded it: chapter 23, chapter 24, chapter 25, chapter 26, and now these are the pages. This must be the pages of the Chinese edition he's using, and now here are the dates. And on his third try, he doesn't cross it out. So he must be satisfied. Okay, so this is just an instance of the translator. I mean, you could have done the translation without doing this preliminary scrutiny, okay? But that's not the kind of worker he is, okay? Now, here he's wondering, there's a reference here. This is in chapter 32. Bao Yu thinks he's speaking to Dai Yu, but actually he's speaking to Si Ren. 今日蛋大说出来就是死了也是甘心的. Okay, now Hawks is thinking about different ways this utterance by Bao Yu might be taken. Presumably, Hawk, and this is I transposed here his handwriting. Presumably, I'm going to tell you, not now I have told you. So there's two different possible ways of reading. 今日大胆说出来 is it I have already told you, or this is what I'm going to, dare to tell you now. Otherwise, the irony of his declaration being made to the wrong girl by mistake is lost. And then he has a second thought. Not necessarily, he says X, meaning what I just wrote above is wrong. Not necessarily, aroma is made, and then he has another thought. And then he has a line to the bottom of the page, and he says, first thoughts better than second thoughts. I don't think Ito got this right. He's referring to a Japanese translator. So he had a thought, he had a second thought, and now he's got a third thought, which is that he was right the first time, after all. Okay. And then you turn the page, or you turn several pages, and 9 days later, and we know this because of the date of the notebook entries, he's still thinking about the same thing. And here he says, third thoughts better than second thoughts, and he's crossed them out, and he says, fourth thoughts better than third thoughts. He keeps going back and forth with different ways of reading this one statement by Bao Yu. And then he says, C.Z. Wang, one of American-based Chinese scholar, and then CXQ Cao Xueqian is too good a dramatist to mean it this way. CF Les Enfants Terribles. He's referring to a modern 20th century French novel, which must have something that reminds him of this scene, of this statement in between the two. Now here's a different instance. He's trying to diagram the layout of the path in chapter 12 that Jia Rui used when he goes to secretly visit Feng Jie in her apartment. And so he Hawks has sketched out what he first imagines would be the path that Jia Rui takes, and then again he says no, and so you know now that he's not going to give up. Okay, so several pages later in the notebook, this is after, I'm not showing you all the pages in between. It's several attempts, and he finally has a much more complicated drawing, and again he's tracing the path that Jia Rui takes to get to Feng Jie's apartment. And at the top of the page he proudly writes, "It's now possible to get a rough idea of the layout of this part of the mansion." Okay, and then here beneath, now that he thinks he's got the layout right, he sticks in other movements. So the route of Bao Yu in chapter 30, the route of Wang Furen and Dai Yu in chapter 3, so now he has a like an architectural layout, a plan of the mansion, and he's going to see how he can use it to make sense of the movements of characters that are being described in the novel. I mentioned the device he uses earlier of translating rather than transliterating the servant's name, so that Ping'er becomes patient, and Yuanyang becomes faithful, etc. This is a page in the notebook where he's actually doing this, where he writes all the servants' names, and he's trying to, sometimes crossing out and getting another name that has occurred to him. He's trying to, and of course, once he decides on these names, he sticks to them, and for the whole translation. This is when he's translating chapter 40 in the notebooks. He takes some time to diagram the dominoes game that's being played, dominoes and riddles, or dominoes and rhymes contest that's being played in chapter 40. And he has the characters' names: Jiamu, Bao Chai, Dai Yu, and the different configurations of dominoes that they're holding, and trying to make sense of how the rhyme relates to the configuration of dots on the dominoes. So this is the level of meticulousness, of care, and attention that Hawkes gives. And I mentioned his commitment to rhyming the poetry. Here are two. I think this is from the first. This is Haitang Shi Se, right? The chapter 37, I think it is, where each character is, they have the Haitang Shi, the poetry club, and each character is writing a poem on the first time they meet. Here's Tan Chun's poem, here's Bao Chai's poem, and you can see him down here trying to work out the rhyme words. Okay, and on another page of the notebook, you can see this is what he tries to do. He tries to figure out, okay, I know, because Chinese 律诗, right? You have to have the second line, the fourth line, the sixth line, the eighth line. Those are the lines that rhyme. Okay, so he tries he's not trying to translate though. He's just trying to figure out what English words. So read, stead, bed, outspread. Then the next poem, different English rhyme: plum, num, lysum, and come. Okay, and then the third poem, flower, hour, bower, tower. And once he's got the rhyme words, then he can try to render each entire line. But he's got to start with a rhyme word, so he knows where the line is going, where it's got to end with those words. And this is his method. This is his methodology. So, what do we think of these pages? I just showed you a few. There's hundreds and hundreds of pages of these notebooks. Someone someday is going to write a dissertation, a PhD dissertation about Hawkes's notebooks. I believe it would be a great topic. But it's interesting that as you maybe are already thinking from just a few pages I showed you, he's not overly concerned with issues of translation per se in these notebooks. He's mostly concerned with getting the meaning of the original Chinese. Okay, all these diagrams, all these attempt to reconstruct the timeline of events, even the diagram of the dominoes. Okay, he wants to know exactly why the characters say what they say, why they say it when they say it, what the meaning of it is in the original, and he wants to represent that accurately in English. So it's a very interesting and well, here I think I've already dealt with this. I said, why did he bother rhyming the poems? I've already explained I think it's his sense of the contribution that the poetry makes to the playfulness, to the gamesmanship, to the spirit of competition and fun and wit that is in the novel. And the poetry means a lot for all that. I don't know if I have time to go into this, but it has occurred to me, I'm sure I'm not the only one that has had this thought, that David Hawkes and John Minford, being British, have certain advantages of translating this novel into English over whatever an American would-be translator might have. And I'll just say this because it may not be so obvious to those of you who are less familiar with British as opposed to American society. A British scholar lives in a society that is closer in many respects to the Qing society, High Qing society of Kangxi, Qianlong, Huangdi, than is American society. Now, that I know that may sound like an outrageous statement, because British society is very different in many respects from Qing Dynasty China. But just think of these few aspects. An educated British intellectual who attended Oxford is of course familiar with titled aristocracy, the world of kings and queens and lords and dukes and royalty. Okay, the educated British who belongs to the British social elite. This is just everyday kind of knowledge. An American translator this would not have that amount of familiarity. There is no royalty in America aside from what we associate with Hollywood. A British intellectual belonging to the upper classes of British society would also be much more comfortable dealing with domestic life in which servants and maids and butlers play a major role, much more comfortable than the American counterpart would be. Americans are, by and large, made very uncomfortable for good reasons with domestic servants. And another thing that could be mentioned here is the British familiarity with classical education, which in the British context, of course, means Latin. So that eventually in Honglou, when we get chapters talking in detail about 保育学那个八股文, in chapter 82 and 84, Minford, who's taken over the translation project by the time you get that late in the novel, uses Latin terminology, uses terminology drawn from the field of Latin rhetoric to translate the Chinese technical terms that are used for Baguwan, the different sections, the different stages of the argument in Baguwan. This is another thing that in the English-speaking world outside of the British Empire, a translator is much less likely to be familiar with. And another of Hawkes's reviewers wrote this apropos of what I'm saying here. David Hawkes, of all people, wrote his friend Cyril Birch, who was also British, had the learning, the wit, and the command of aristocratic culture to meet the challenge of translating Honglou into English. And I think this is a very I put those words in italics, and the command of aristocratic culture to meet the challenge. I think that's very perceptive. Oh, I thought I'd show you this. David Hawkes's Hong Kong friends on the occasion of his 80th birthday, put together a commemorative volume of essays celebrating him, and as you see, entitled it A Birthday Book for Brother Stone. 师兄 is the way his Hong Kong friends came to think of him. Okay, in the time that's left, I'll say quickly, what else needs to be done to make Honglou part of world literature? Well, the first prerequisite, an excellent English translation, that has been done thanks to Hawkes and Manfred. A reader's guide, we can imagine, with plot summaries and explanatory information for non-Chinese readers. I know of at least one that's in progress. A well-crafted, abridged edition, if you remember what I was saying about Arthur Whaley's translation of COG, I think an abridgment of the Hawkes-Manfred translation, which, you know, is selectively represents the brilliance of their translation, would be very handy. And lastly, what would be accomplished or gained if《红楼梦》若共视为世界文学经典之一，you know, what would the advantages of that be? Well, the most obvious advantage is that it would facilitate knowledge around the world of the richness and depth of pre-modern Chinese culture and society. And since the world outside of Chinese communities is so woefully ignorant of the greatness of Chinese history and Chinese culture, this is not something that's unimportant. This is something that would be an enormous contribution. But I'd like to go beyond that, and not just talk about how Honglou Meng could be, the English Honglou Meng could be a kind of cultural ambassador and have the effect of informing the world better about Chinese cultural history. But what else could it do for what contribution could it make beyond that to world literature? And here I've just thought of a few things, a few contributions that it could make. It could, if it became known, if this regrettable situation in which even professors of literature, unless their field is Chinese, in the rest of the world, are to this day almost entirely uninformed about the existence of this novel, much less its qualities. It could have, it could change and improve and enrich our understanding of the early history of this great genre, the novel in global history. It could show, for example, that very early on, there was, in the case of Cao Xueqin and Honglou Meng in China, there was a sudden appearance of a novel that is not only, you know, long and complex and engrossing, but is also deeply critical of the society in which the author lived. That is to say, it seems to me that we tend to think of the early novel in England or France or Spain or wherever as focusing on human problems of the main characters, the protagonists in the novel. Certainly Honglou Meng does that, but in addition, as you I'm sure know by now, it also is relentless in calling attention to the ills of the society in which Cao Xueqian lived, okay? Whether it be calling attention to the suffering caused by the unequal treatment of women, all the anguish and grief caused by the domination of the older generation over the younger generation. So one is gender inequality. One is generational inequality. Think of how the young people, one by one, are made to suffer as the novel moves toward its end by choices about betrothal and marriage being made for them, mostly bad choices, mostly the wrong choices, made for the wrong reasons by their parents, or think of the novel's unsparing attention to the corruption of the older men in the Jia clan, except for Jia Zheng. The rest of them are in many cases unspeakably corrupt, whether corrupted by money or morality, lust, etc. It's a very unflinching and a very damning portrait that this novel gives of so many aspects of the society. Cao Xueqian is he's not only a genius at a depiction of character, he's also a genius for his ability to step outside his own society and to view it in a harsh and an unforgiving light. And I think if people knew this, they would have it would change people's perception of early novels in world literature, because I can't think of one that is as exceptional in this regard for the author's own harsh assessment of the world in which he lives, and the author's commitment to bringing the suffering of these injustices, these abuses of power, to documenting them and showing them in the pages of the novel, I think. And the only other thing I'll mention is the psychological dimension of the depiction of characters. It's almost, and Hawke says this at one point in his introduction, as we read Honglou Meng, we almost have to pinch ourselves to remind ourselves that Freud and psychoanalysis didn't exist in the world of Cao Xueqian, because he anticipates so many of the insights of subconscious, of unspoken anxieties and fears that we have. Think of the dreams, the nightmare scenes, Dayu's nightmares about what's going to happen to her. Think of all the psychological rightness, the penetrating psychological depictions of the characters' insecurities. This is really, to have in the 18th century, in the mid 18th century, a novel that is so psychologically insightful. I'm not sure that there's anything else written at the time that would stand up to Honglou Meng in that respect. So in these ways, I think it's really a shame that that more people don't know about this great masterpiece of world literature, and that it's not recognized yet. It will be one day. It will be, just as foreign literature of all kinds eventually, if, of high caliber, of high quality, comes to be recognized. But some of us who find ourselves working in this field outside of Chinese communities do what we can to bring this novel into the awareness and consciousness of people who don't otherwise know, because it certainly deserves to be in people's awareness. So with that, I think my time is just about up today. And I thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to speaking with you again next week. Good day.